What was the role of Africa in world history? The conventional answer, the one embedded in most educational systems worldwide, is peripheral. Background. A place that things happen to, not a place that made things happen. The true answer is precisely the opposite. Africa was not peripheral to world history. Africa was world history, for the vast majority of human existence, and it continues to shape the world in ways that most people have never been taught to recognize. Africa's roles in world history are layered and comprehensive. Africa is where humanity originated and evolved. Africa is where the first cities, writing systems, mathematical texts, and medical textbooks were created. Africa is where the agricultural and astronomical knowledge that underpins modern civilization was developed. Africa's trade networks were the circulatory system of the ancient world. African labor stolen through slavery built the economic foundations of the modern Western world. African resources fueled the industrial revolutions that created the contemporary global economy. African philosophical traditions gave the world concepts of human dignity, community, and justice that underpin modern human rights frameworks. Every chapter of world history has an African dimension. Today we are going to explore those chapters together. Welcome to Griot Wave Academy. Africa's role in world history is not a single story. It is every story. Let me map it for you. Chapter 1. The Origin. Every human being on Earth today is of African descent. Not symbolically, biologically, genetically. The earliest anatomically modern Homo sapiens fossils are in Africa, dating to 315,000 years ago. For 235,000 of those years, from the emergence of our species to the out-of-Africa migration 70,000 years ago, all human life was African life. Chapter 2. Civilization. Africa did not just originate humanity, it built civilization. The oldest writing systems, mathematical texts, medical textbooks, universities, and trade networks are all African. At every point in history, Africa had civilizations that were contemporary with, or ahead of, anything happening in Europe or Asia. Chapter 3. Trade. Africa was not a passive recipient of trade. It was the engine. African gold drove Mediterranean, Islamic, and eventually global economies for millennia. The world's first transcontinental customs system was run from West Africa. Chapter 4. The Wound. The Atlantic slave trade and European colonialism represent the most systematic destruction of wealth, knowledge, and human potential in history. 12.5 million Africans enslaved. The entire continent carved up by 13 European powers at a conference in Berlin in 1884, without a single African present. Chapter 5. Resistance and Renaissance. Africa fought back. It is still fighting. The independence movements of the 1950s and 60s. Pan-Africanism. The African Union. And now the African Renaissance. The deliberate project of African civilizational renewal. Chapter 6. The Future. This is the chapter being written right now. Africa's first and most fundamental role in world history is simply this. It is where we all come from. This is not a metaphor or a philosophical proposition. It is the most precisely verified conclusion in the history of human science. The fossil record, the genetic record, the archaeological record, all converge on the same answer. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa from African ancestors over hundreds of thousands of years. The oldest known Homo sapiens fossils, found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco in 2017, are 315,000 years old. For the subsequent 235,000 years, all human beings were African. There were no humans anywhere else on Earth. There were no Europeans, no Asians, no Native Americans. There were Africans, in Africa, developing language, developing tools, developing symbolic thought, developing art, developing science, entirely in Africa. Then, approximately 65,000 to 70,000 years ago, a small group left. A founding population of perhaps 1,000 to 10,000 individuals crossed out of Africa, probably across the narrowed Bab el-Mandeb Strait between East Africa and Arabia. Every non-African person alive today descends from that small group. Think about what they carried with them when they left. Not just their bodies, their minds. Hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated African human knowledge, language, toolmaking, fire control, symbolic thought, long-distance trade. The cognitive and cultural toolkit that would allow Homo sapiens to populate the globe in just 50,000 years, that toolkit was made in Africa. The role of Africa in world history begins before world history begins. It begins with humanity itself. Before the pyramids, before writing, before cities, there was agriculture. And Africa was at the origin of the agricultural revolution that made all of those things possible. The Nile Valley's agricultural development, beginning around 10,000 BCE, created the food surplus that made complex civilization possible. You cannot have full-time priests, engineers, mathematicians, and artists unless someone else is growing enough food to feed them. The Nile Valley's extraordinary agricultural productivity One harvest per year from the flood-renewed soil, reliable as clockwork, created the foundation for everything Egyptian civilization built. But this is not only an Egyptian story. Africa developed agriculture independently in multiple locations. Sorghum, now one of the world's most important cereal crops, feeding hundreds of millions of people, was domesticated in the Sahel region of Africa around 7000 BCE. West Africa developed its own independent agricultural traditions around the same period. Ethiopia domesticated coffee approximately 1000 BCE. And today the world drinks 3 billion cups of coffee per day from that Ethiopian origin. And then the coffee story takes a darker turn. The agricultural knowledge of enslaved West Africans was critical to the development of American plantation agriculture. Enslaved Africans who understood rice cultivation from their West African homeland were specifically selected by plantation owners in South Carolina and Georgia. Their agricultural expertise, stolen along with their freedom, built the American agricultural economy. Africa's agricultural contribution to world history is not a footnote. It is the foundation. If you want to understand how the world's ancient and medieval economies actually worked, you have to understand Africa's role in global trade. Because for most of human history, African trade was not a sideshow. It was the main event. Let's start with gold. For nearly 2,000 years, from approximately 300 BCE to 1600 CE, West African gold was the monetary foundation of the Mediterranean and Islamic worlds. The Mali Empire controlled an estimated 50% of the world's gold supply. When Islamic caliphates minted their golden dinars, when Venice and Genoa ran their commercial empires, when the Ottoman Empire maintained its treasury, the gold backing those economies had largely come from the goldfields of West Africa, from the Bambouk and Bura regions, transported north across the Sahara by camel caravan. The Indian Ocean trade is equally significant. East Africa's Swahili city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Zanzibar, were nodes in the world's most sophisticated medieval trade network. Chinese porcelain has been found buried in Kenyan soil. Persian glass, Indian textiles. These are not rare finds. They are common at East African archaeological sites, evidence of sustained, deep commercial integration. Ibn Battuta visited East Africa in 1331 and called Kilwa one of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities in the world. When the world's most experienced traveler, who had seen Egypt, Constantinople, Persia, India, and China, called an East African city one of the most beautiful in the world, that tells you something about what was there. Africa was not marginal to world trade. Africa financed world trade. Africa's role in the intellectual history of humanity is not merely significant, it is foundational. The knowledge systems that underpin modern science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy were substantially developed in Africa before Greece existed as a civilization. Mathematics. The Rhind Mathematical Papyrus is the world's oldest complete mathematics textbook. Written by an Egyptian scribe named Ahmes around 1650 BCE, from material dating to 1850 BCE. It contains 84 mathematical problems and a value for pi of approximately 3.1605, accurate to within 0.5%. Archimedes, celebrated as the discoverer of pi, worked on this problem around 250 BCE. Egypt had this value 1,600 years earlier. Medicine, Imhotep, 2650 BCE. The world's first named physician. He is also the architect of the Step Pyramid, the world's first large stone building. He was eventually deified as the Egyptian god of medicine. When Greek visitors came to Egypt and saw the temples dedicated to Imhotep, they identified him with their own god of medicine, Asclepius. The symbol of medicine, the snake-entwined staff, traces through this Greek-Egyptian connection. Your doctor's emblem has African roots. Astronomy. The Nabta Playa stone circle in Egypt's Nubian desert was built 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, 2,000 years before Stonehenge. Its stones are aligned to the summer solstice and specific stars. This is organized, systematic astronomical observation driving practical calendar science. And the calendar. The Egyptian solar calendar, established around 4200 BCE, is the direct ancestor of every calendar used in the world today. Julius Caesar adopted it. Pope Gregory XIII reformed it. When your phone reminds you of an appointment on Thursday the 15th, the structure of that calendar was built in Africa 6,000 years ago. There is no way to discuss Africa's role in world history without confronting the Atlantic slave trade, the most brutal chapter of that history, and the one that most directly shaped the world we live in today. 12.5 million human beings. Torn from their families, their communities, their languages, their names. Branded with iron, transported across the Atlantic in conditions so horrific that approximately 2 million died before they arrived. This was not an accident of history. It was the deliberate policy of European nations, legally sanctioned, commercially organized, and economically motivated. The economic scale of what was built on this crime is staggering. The economists Sven Becker and Edward Baptiste have documented how enslaved African cotton production in the American South was not just one sector of the American economy, it was the foundation of the entire 19th century American financial system. The cotton that enslaved Africans were forced to grow financed Wall Street's first major investment banks. It financed the building of New York City. It financed the Ivy League universities that educated America's elite. In Britain, the wealth generated by the Caribbean sugar economy, powered entirely by enslaved African labor, was a major source of the capital that financed the Industrial Revolution. Eric Williams, in his landmark book Capitalism and Slavery, traced the direct line from African enslaved labor to British industrial wealth. And the skills. Enslaved Africans were not blank slates of unskilled labor. They brought expert knowledge from Africa, rice cultivation techniques from West Africa that made South Carolina's rice economy possible, metallurgical knowledge, textile production, medicinal plant expertise. These African skills, transferred without consent, were critical to the economic development of the Americas. The modern Western world was built on African labor and African knowledge stolen. November 1884. Bismarck's Chancellery in Berlin. 13 European nations. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Austria-Hungary, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, Russia, and the United States as an observer. They are meeting to formalize the rules by which they will divide Africa among themselves. Not a single African is in the room. Not a single African government has been consulted. Not a single African leader has been invited. A continent of hundreds of millions of people, with thousands of years of complex political history, is being carved up like a cake at a birthday party, and the birthday boy isn't invited. The borders they drew, many with actual rulers on maps, cut through kingdoms, through ethnic groups, through river systems, through cultural zones that had existed for centuries. The Yoruba people were divided between Nigeria and Benin. The Somali people were divided among 5 different colonial territories. The Tuareg were divided among 6 different countries. These borders created fault lines that would generate political conflict for generations. The extraction was systematic and catastrophic. In the Belgian Congo, King Leopold II imposed rubber quotas on Congolese workers, and when quotas were not met, hands were cut off as punishment. An estimated 10 million Congolese died under Leopold's rule between 1885 and 1908. The British extracted wool, cotton, and minerals from across Africa at prices set entirely by British merchants, for profits that flowed entirely to London. The economic historian Utsa Patnaik estimated that Britain extracted £45 trillion from India during the colonial period. Similar scale extractions happened across Africa. The wealth that funded British Empire, French grandeur, Belgian industry, it came substantially from Africa. Colonialism did not develop Africa. It was designed to extract from Africa. And it succeeded. One of the most persistent and most damaging myths about colonial history is that Africans were passive, that they accepted colonialism without fighting it. This myth serves the colonizers' narrative. If Africans didn't resist, perhaps they didn't mind. Perhaps they even welcomed it. The truth is the precise opposite. African resistance to colonization was continuous, widespread, and frequently successful. The slave trade was resisted in Africa from the moment it began. The colonial period was resisted everywhere it was imposed. The tools of resistance varied: military confrontation, political negotiation, armed guerrilla warfare, mass political organization, international diplomacy, but the resistance never stopped. Queen Nzinga, for 40 years, this extraordinary woman fought the Portuguese colonization of Angola. She made alliances with the Dutch. She built coalitions among neighboring peoples. She led military campaigns personally. When the Portuguese governor refused to provide a chair for her, to signal her subordinate status, she had one of her attendants kneel to serve as her throne. She was negotiating as an equal. She died in her 80s, still resisting. Angola remembers her as its founding national hero. Menelik II and the Battle of Adwa, March 1896. An Italian colonial army, advancing to establish Italian colonial rule over Ethiopia, met Menelik's force of 100,000 Ethiopian soldiers. The Italians were comprehensively defeated, in what remains the most decisive African military victory over a European colonial power in the modern era. The defeat was so complete that Italy was forced to sign a peace treaty recognizing Ethiopian sovereignty. Adwa's significance cannot be overstated. It proved that African military organization could defeat European technology. African independence movements cited Adwa for the next 60 years as proof that colonial rule was not inevitable. And Mandela, 27 years in prison, and he came out not broken, but as the first president of a democratic South Africa. Pan-Africanism, the idea that African people, wherever they are, on the continent, in the Caribbean, in North America, in Europe, share a common destiny and must work together for collective liberation. This idea, born from the intellectual response to the Atlantic slave trade and European colonialism, became one of the most powerful political forces of the 20th century. W.E.B. Du Bois opened the first Pan-African Congress in London in 1900 with a declaration: "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." That sentence, written by a Black American intellectual in London at the turn of the century, framed the political agenda of the entire 20th century. From the independence movements, to the civil rights movement, to anti-apartheid, to the global struggle against racial capitalism. Marcus Garvey built the Universal Negro Improvement Association into the largest Black political organization in history, 2 million members by 1921. His vision of African dignity, self-determination, and economic independence influenced everything from the Rastafarian movement to the Nation of Islam to Malcolm X. Kwame Nkrumah brought Pan-Africanism to state power. When Ghana became independent in 1957, Nkrumah said, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa." He then convened the first All-African Peoples Conference in Accra in 1958 and invited independence leaders from across the continent to plan together. That conference was the intellectual engine of the African independence wave of the 1960s. Pan-Africanism is not a historical relic. The African Union is Pan-Africanism institutionalized. The African Continental Free Trade Area is Pan-Africanism as economic policy. The idea is still active and still growing. Africa's role in world history is not confined to the African continent. Through the forced dispersal of the slave trade and the voluntary migration of the modern era, African culture, knowledge, and people have shaped virtually every corner of the world, most profoundly in the Americas. Approximately 200 million people of African descent live outside Africa. This is not a static diaspora. It is a dynamic, creative, politically engaged community that has shaped the nations it lives in while maintaining connections to Africa. The Americas were built by African hands. The cotton economy that financed American industrialization. The sugar economy that made the Caribbean the most economically valuable real estate in the 18th century world. The rice economy of South Carolina. The tobacco economy of Virginia. All built by enslaved Africans. And the people who built this wealth, the enslaved Africans and their descendants, were systematically excluded from inheriting it. But exclusion did not eliminate creativity. African American culture is one of the most generative cultural forces in human history. Jazz, invented in New Orleans in the late 19th century from a synthesis of African musical traditions, blues, and European harmonic structures, is now played in every country on earth. Hip-hop, invented in the South Bronx in the 1970s, is now the world's most streamed music genre. Rock and roll, which shaped all of popular music from the 1950s onward, was created from African American blues and gospel traditions. Haiti's Revolution of 1804 deserves particular recognition, the first successful slave revolution in history, producing the world's first Black republic. Haitian revolutionary leaders, inspired by the French Revolution's ideals while excluded from its benefits, created something more radical, a revolution that abolished slavery and declared the universal human dignity of Black people, 60 years before the American Civil War. We need to talk about the material foundation of Africa's role in world history, the mineral and agricultural wealth that has driven global economies for millennia and will continue to shape the global economy for decades to come. Africa holds 40% of the world's gold reserves, 90% of its cobalt, 50% of its diamonds, 80% of its platinum group metals, 30% of its uranium, 33% of all global mineral reserves. This is not a continent of poverty. It is a continent of extraordinary wealth that has been, and continues to be, systematically extracted. During the colonial period, this extraction was legally enforced at gunpoint. The Belgian Congo's rubber extraction killed an estimated 10 million Congolese through the quota system. South Africa's diamond and gold mines were built on black forced labor and apartheid economics. Cecil Rhodes built what became Anglo American, one of the world's largest mining companies, from Zimbabwean gold and South African diamonds, on land seized from indigenous people. The resource curse. Nigeria has earned over $1 trillion from oil since the 1960s. The average Nigerian is no wealthier than they were 50 years ago. The wealth flows through corrupt elite networks, into foreign banks, into foreign consumer goods, and into the pockets of foreign oil companies. The problem is not oil. It is the extraction terms and governance failures that have been deliberately cultivated by foreign powers with interests in keeping Africa producing raw materials rather than processing them. The green energy paradox. The world needs cobalt for electric car batteries. 90% of cobalt comes from the DRC. Children mine it by hand in artisanal operations, for wages that amount to dollars per day. The cobalt goes to China for processing, to South Korea for battery manufacturing, to Germany for car assembly. The Congolese economy receives approximately 3 to 5% of the final value. This is the colonial extraction model, still operating. The role of Africa's enslaved people in building the modern Western economy is the most important fact in economic history that most people have never been taught. Eric Williams, in his 1944 book Capitalism and Slavery, made the argument that the wealth of the British Empire, including the capital that financed the Industrial Revolution, was substantially generated by the Caribbean slave economy. This argument was initially marginalized by mainstream academic economics. Decades of subsequent research have confirmed it. The numbers are staggering. American enslaved cotton production grew from $5 million per year in 1800 to $200 million by 1860. Edward Baptiste, in The Half Has Never Been Told, calculates that by 1836, enslaved people in the American South represented the largest single category of financial capital in the United States, valued at approximately $1.3 billion, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's money. These enslaved people were used as collateral for bank loans. Bonds backed by enslaved people were sold to investors in London, Amsterdam, and Paris. The global financial system was literally collateralized on African bodies. Sven Beckert's Empire of Cotton traces how enslaved African cotton production in the American South, combined with colonial cotton extraction in India, created the global textile industry that was the engine of the first industrial revolution. Without African cotton, no Manchester Mill. Without Manchester Mills, no industrial revolution. Without the Industrial Revolution, the modern world as we know it does not exist. The reparations question. CARICOM, the Caribbean community, has formally requested reparations from European governments. The argument is straightforward. The wealth was taken, the harm was done, the beneficiaries are identifiable, the victims' descendants are identifiable. What justice requires is clear. In 1957, Kwame Nkrumah stood at the podium in Accra, Ghana, and said, "At long last, the battle has ended, and thus Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." The crowd erupted. And then, over the next decade, country after country across Africa followed. 1960 alone, 17 nations independent in a single year. Cameroon, Senegal, Togo, Mali, Madagascar, Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo-Brazzaville, Gabon, Nigeria, Mauritania, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Somalia. 17 countries. 1 year. This is a political earthquake with no historical precedent. The leaders of these movements deserve to be celebrated as world historical figures. Kwame Nkrumah, the most intellectually sophisticated Pan-African leader, who wrote foundational texts on African unity and neocolonialism. Julius Nyerere, who developed Ujamaa African socialism as an alternative to both American capitalism and Soviet communism. Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a brilliant orator and genuine African nationalist, assassinated within months of independence in an operation the CIA later acknowledged involvement in. Lumumba's murder is one of the great crimes of the Cold War. The global impact of African independence cannot be overstated. 54 African nations and the United Nations changed the voting arithmetic of the entire institution. African diplomatic voices, especially on questions of racism, colonialism, and economic inequality, shifted global discourse. The non-aligned movement, of which many African nations were founding members, created a political alternative to the US-Soviet binary. But the unfinished project, political flags changed. Economic extraction structures largely did not. Neocolonialism, in Nkrumah's own term, is still the operating system of much of Africa's relationship with the world economy. Both world wars are usually told as European stories, with a significant American chapter. The African contribution to both wars is enormous, and almost entirely absent from mainstream historical education in Europe and America. World War I. Approximately 1.2 million African soldiers were mobilized by the colonial powers. The British drew on West African, East African, and South African troops. The French relied heavily on their tirailleurs Senegalese, West African troops, who fought across multiple theaters. African soldiers died in the mud of Flanders, in the desert campaigns, and in the African campaign. The East African campaign between German and Allied forces was actually one of the war's most remarkable episodes. Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck's German-led force in East Africa fought until November 1918, 2 weeks after the European armistice, in a campaign fought almost entirely by African soldiers on both sides. World War II. The North African campaign is taught in some detail in military history courses, but the African contribution to it is systematically underemphasized. The defeat of Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein in 1942 was one of the war's decisive turning points. Without control of North Africa, the Allied Mediterranean strategy could not have succeeded. And African resources were critical for the whole Allied war effort. Uranium from the Belgian Congo was essential for the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bombs. Copper, chromium, and cobalt from Central and Southern Africa were vital for weapons manufacturing. And then the broken promise. African soldiers who had fought and died for freedom and democracy, the stated Allied war aims, returned home to colonial rule. The same colonial powers they had fought for, denied them the freedom they had helped defend. This hypocrisy radicalized a generation of African leaders. Many of the independence movement's founders had served in the Allied forces. Let me make a claim that sounds audacious but is historically supportable. Africa and the African diaspora have produced more of the world's popular music than any other cultural tradition in human history. Trace the genealogy of global music. Jazz. Invented in New Orleans in the late 19th and early 20th century, from a synthesis of West African musical traditions brought by enslaved Africans, blues, and European harmonic structures. The polyrhythmic complexity of jazz, the layered rhythms, the call and response, the improvisation, is West African. Blues, Mississippi Delta, from the work songs and field hollers of enslaved and freed African Americans. Rock and roll, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, African American creators building on blues and gospel. Hip-hop, invented in the South Bronx in the 1970s by Black and Latino youth, drawing on African American oral traditions that trace back to West African griot storytelling. Every single one of those genres is the most influential music of its era, and every single one traces, directly, to African or African diasporic origins. The visual art story is equally extraordinary. Pablo Picasso's encounter with African masks in 1907 directly catalyzed Cubism, the art movement that broke European representational painting and opened the door to all of 20th century modern art. Picasso himself acknowledged this. The Fauve, the Expressionists, the Abstract Expressionists, all were influenced by African aesthetic principles. The avant-garde of Western visual art has African roots. And literature, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, published in 1958 from Nigeria, is the most widely read African novel in history, translated into more than 57 languages. It single-handedly changed how world literature understood and depicted African humanity. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Pause the video right now and scan the QR code to join the early interest list. Africa's role in the world's philosophical and ethical traditions is one of the most consistently overlooked dimensions of its contribution to world history. Ma'at. In ancient Egypt, approximately 2700 BCE, the concept of Ma'at, truth, justice, balance, cosmic order, was not just a religious idea. It was a systematic ethical framework governing how human beings should relate to each other, to the state, to nature, and to the cosmos. The 42 negative confessions, the declarations of innocence made by the deceased before the divine court, contain prohibitions against killing, stealing, lying, injustice, cruelty, and corruption. These prohibitions predate the 10 Commandments of the Hebrew Bible by approximately 1,000 to 1,500 years. Some biblical scholars have argued that the moral framework of the Hebrew Bible was substantially influenced by Egyptian ethical traditions. Ubuntu. Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. A person is a person through other people. This Bantu philosophical concept challenges the hyper-individualism of Western liberal political philosophy. Ubuntu says, you are not an isolated individual who enters into social contracts with other isolated individuals. You are constituted by your relationships. You exist through others. Your humanity is realized through community. Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu used Ubuntu as the philosophical foundation for South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Rather than pursuing revenge or imprisonment for apartheid perpetrators, the TRC sought truth-telling, acknowledgement, and community restoration. This was Ubuntu in practice, and it is now studied worldwide as a model for post-conflict justice. The roots of Western philosophy. Pythagoras studied in Egypt. Plato spent time in North Africa. Thales, considered the first Greek philosopher, was from Miletus in what is now Turkey, close to Egypt's sphere of influence. The African philosophical tradition predates and substantially influenced the Greek tradition that Western philosophy claims as its origin. Africa's role in world history is not only in the ancient past, it continues into the present, in science, technology, and innovation. December 3, 1967. Groote Schuur Hospital, Cape Town. Dr. Christian Barnard and his surgical team spend 9 hours performing the world's first successful human-to-human heart transplant. Louis Washkansky, the patient, lived for 18 days. The surgery demonstrated that heart transplantation was medically feasible, and every subsequent heart transplant, including the hundreds of thousands that have since saved lives worldwide, builds on this South African achievement. But the story has another dimension that apartheid tried to erase. Hamilton Nucky was a black South African gardener at Groote Schuur Hospital who taught himself surgery by observing operations and was informally trained by surgeons who recognized his exceptional skill. He performed transplant surgery in the animal laboratory that directly contributed to Barnard's human transplant technique. Under apartheid, he could not be formally credited. The system that barred him from medical school also barred him from recognition. He was paid a gardener's salary for surgical work. His story is Africa's story. Contribution without credit, skill without recognition. M-Pesa. In 2007, when Silicon Valley was focused on Facebook and social media, Kenya launched M-Pesa mobile money that worked on basic feature phones, not smartphones. Within 5 years, the majority of Kenya's adults were using it. Western tech companies spent the next decade trying to replicate what Kenyan engineers had already built. Africa did not wait for the West to invent financial inclusion. Africa invented it. And the space program. South Africa's Square Kilometre Array is the world's most ambitious radio astronomy project, a collaboration involving multiple countries, hosted in the Karoo Desert. Africa is building the infrastructure of 21st century science. Africa's role in the world's great religious traditions is profound and systematically overlooked. Christianity is commonly presented as a European religion, but its deepest intellectual roots are African. The theologians who defined what Christians believe about the nature of God, the Trinity, the person of Jesus, and the nature of salvation. Tertullian, Carthage, North Africa. Origen, Alexandria, Egypt. Cyprian, Carthage. Athanasius, Alexandria. And most significantly Augustine of Hippo, Algeria, were all African. Augustine of Hippo's Confessions and City of God are arguably the most influential works in the entire Christian intellectual tradition. They were written by a North African. In North Africa, the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, fled to Egypt to escape Herod. The Gospel of Matthew records this explicitly. Jesus lived in Egypt for part of his childhood. Africa sheltered the founder of Christianity. For Islam, the very first migration of the early Muslim community, the first hijra, before the famous migration to Medina, was to Ethiopia. When the early Muslims were being persecuted in Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad sent them to the Aksumite kingdom of Ethiopia, where the Christian king Ashama ibn Abjar granted them protection. Africa gave the early Islamic community its survival. Without Ethiopian protection, the early Muslim community might not have survived the Meccan persecution. And Timbuktu, the greatest center of Islamic scholarship in the 15th century world, was in West Africa. More manuscripts, more scholars, more students than any contemporary Islamic city. Africa was the intellectual capital of the Islamic world. The world drinks 3 billion cups of coffee per day. Every single one of those cups traces its origin to the highlands of Ethiopia, where the Coffea arabica plant grows wild, and where coffee cultivation was first developed approximately 1,000 years ago. The word coffee may derive from Kaffa, the Ethiopian region where coffee was first cultivated. The coffee ceremony, an elaborate social ritual still practiced in Ethiopia today, is one of the most sophisticated beverage traditions in the world. And the Ethiopian farmers who grow the original arabica beans, in the birthplace of the world's most popular drink, receive approximately 2% of the retail value of the coffee they grow. The rest goes to roasters, distributors, and coffee shops in Europe, North America, and Asia. This is the pattern. Africa produces, the world profits. Sorghum, domesticated in Africa 7,000 years ago, now feeding hundreds of millions across South Asia and the Americas. The crop was given to the world without compensation or credit. Cocoa, 70% of global supply from West Africa, captured at 2 to 3% of final value. The agricultural knowledge story is equally important. Enslaved West Africans brought rice cultivation expertise from their homeland to South Carolina and Georgia. The Carolina Gold rice variety that made those colonies enormously wealthy was cultivated using West African techniques by West African farmers working in chains. The American agricultural tradition of the South is substantially West African agriculture, transported across the Atlantic by force. When we talk about Africa's role in world food history, we are talking about an enormous contribution that has been systematically uncredited and uncompensated. Africa's role in the climate crisis is one of the most profound moral stories of our time, and it perfectly encapsulates Africa's relationship with the rest of the world. Africa has emitted approximately 4% of the greenhouse gases that have accumulated in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. The United States has emitted approximately 25%, the European Union approximately 22%. China is now the largest annual emitter, though its cumulative historical contribution is lower than the US and EU. Yet Africa is projected to suffer more from climate change than any other region. The Sahel is expanding into agricultural land that feeds tens of millions. East Africa is experiencing droughts of increasing severity and frequency. Southern Africa faces a combination of increased flooding and drought. Coastal cities like Lagos and Dar es Salaam are at risk from sea level rise. The continent that did the least to cause the problem, bears the worst of the consequences. This is not a natural phenomenon. It is the structural consequence of development inequality produced by colonialism. African economies are more dependent on agriculture, less able to afford adaptation infrastructure, more exposed to commodity price volatility, and less able to transition away from fossil fuels without external financial support. At COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2022, African nations, led by the Alliance of Small Island States and Developing Country Coalitions, successfully lobbied for the establishment of a loss and damage fund to compensate vulnerable nations for climate damages. This was a major diplomatic achievement for African nations. The fund exists. Whether it will be adequately funded, that is the test. And the green minerals. The transition to renewable energy depends entirely on African geology. The cobalt for your electric vehicle battery comes from the DRC. The lithium for your phone comes from Africa. The manganese for solar panels comes from Africa. Africa has the physical wealth that the green future requires. One of the most important intellectual projects of our time is tracing the actual chain of intellectual inheritance. Because the standard story that Western academic culture tells about the origins of knowledge is systematically wrong. The standard narrative goes, ancient Greece developed philosophy, mathematics, and science. Rome transmitted Greek culture to Europe. Medieval Europe preserved it. Then the Renaissance and scientific revolution built the modern world. This narrative has an obvious self-serving quality. It places European civilization at the center of all intellectual development. The actual chain is more interesting. Greek philosophers explicitly acknowledge their debt to Egypt. This is not a modern revisionist claim. It is what the Greeks themselves wrote. Pythagoras, according to multiple ancient sources, spent 22 years in Egypt studying with Egyptian priests. The theorem we call the Pythagorean theorem was known to Egyptian mathematical practitioners centuries before Pythagoras. Plato's dialogues repeatedly reference Egyptian wisdom. Herodotus described Egyptian civilization as the source of Greek religion, architecture, and art. Then the Islamic Golden Age. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Greek texts would have been entirely lost to European civilization, and almost were. They were preserved, translated, and extensively extended by Arab and Persian scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba. For 500 years, the Islamic world maintained and extended the intellectual tradition that Europe had lost. When the European Renaissance recovered Greek knowledge in the 12th and 13th centuries, it did so by translating Arabic texts, and those Arabic texts themselves built on Egyptian-African foundations. The actual chain: Africa right-pointing arrow, Greece right-pointing arrow, Islamic world right-pointing arrow, Europe right-pointing arrow, modern science. The version taught in Western universities: Greece right-pointing arrow, Europe right-pointing arrow, modern science. The omission is not a minor editing choice. It is the intellectual foundation of the colonial worldview. Ubuntu, umuntung gumuntung abantu. In Zulu and Nguni languages, a person is a person through other people. In Swahili, mtu ni watu. In Soto, motoke motoka bato. Across dozens of African languages, the same philosophical insight: you do not exist alone. Your humanity is realized through your relationships with other human beings. This is not merely a cultural sentiment. It is a complete philosophical system that challenges the foundations of Western liberal political philosophy. Western liberalism is built on the isolated individual. The natural state of humanity is independent individuals who voluntarily form social contracts for mutual benefit. Rights are primarily individual. My right to property, my right to speech, my right to vote. The community is a means to individual ends. Ubuntu inverts this. The community is not a means to individual ends. The individual is constituted by the community. You have no separate self that exists prior to your relationships. You are your relationships. Rights without responsibilities are incoherent. The individual's flourishing is inseparable from the community's flourishing. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Desmond Tutu, designed it explicitly on Ubuntu principles. He said, "My humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up, in yours." Therefore, punishing apartheid perpetrators without pursuing healing for the community was insufficient. What was needed was truth-telling, acknowledgement, and reconciliation. Ubuntu, in legal form. The TRC is now studied in law schools worldwide as one of the most creative approaches to post-conflict justice ever devised. It is Africa's gift to international legal theory. And the climate justice application. The argument that wealthy nations owe compensation to poor nations for climate damage is an Ubuntu argument. My prosperity cannot be inseparable from your suffering. The future of Africa is not a hope or an aspiration. It is a mathematical certainty. The question is only, who will shape that future, and on whose terms? The demographic reality: by 2050, Africa will have 2.5 billion people, 25% of the world's total population. And the median age will be approximately 25 years, young, working age, productive. While Europe, Japan, and China face severe demographic aging, workforce is shrinking, pension systems strained, economies contracting, Africa will have the world's largest reservoir of human capital. The economic projections follow directly from this. The McKinsey Global Institute has estimated that Africa's consumer market will be worth $5.6 trillion by 2025. The African Development Bank projects the continent's GDP to reach $29 trillion by 2050. These are conservative projections based on current growth trajectories. The African Continental Free Trade Area is the mechanism. 54 countries, 1.3 billion consumers, a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. The largest free trade area in the world by geographic size and country membership. When fully implemented, it will transform the structure of African economies, from commodity exporters to value-added manufacturers. This is the transition from the colonial resource model to an African-led industrial model. Digital leapfrogging. Africa is doing with digital infrastructure what it did with telecommunications, skipping the landline era entirely and going directly to mobile. African entrepreneurs are building fintech, e-commerce, health tech, and agri-tech companies on mobile platforms. The African tech ecosystem attracted over $5 billion in investment in 2021 alone. Green energy. Africa has 40% of the world's renewable energy potential. The world's green future is going to be powered substantially by African sunlight, African wind, and African geothermal energy. 5 myths. Direct answers. Myth 1. Africa had no role in world history until colonialism. Africa originated humanity. It ran the world's gold trade. It housed the greatest library in the ancient world. It gave the world mathematics and medicine. Colonialism represents 0.3% of Africa's historical timeline. Myth 2. Africa only gave the world problems. Coffee, jazz, hip-hop, mathematics, medicine, the calendar, mobile banking, the world's first heart transplant, the geological wealth that will power the green energy transition. Africa is the most generative continent in human history. Myth 3. African slavery was already happening before Europeans arrived. This is used to minimize the Atlantic slave trade. Pre-colonial African slavery was fundamentally different. Smaller scale, not race-based, with integration pathways. The Atlantic slave trade was unique in scale, race permanence, legal codification, and economic structure. False equivalence. Myth 4. Colonialism developed Africa. Africa's GDP per capita, relative to Europe's, declined during colonialism. The opposite of development occurred. Extraction, yes. Development, no. Myth 5. Africa is a lost cause economically. 60% of world's uncultivated arable land. 40% of gold. 90% of cobalt. World's largest working-age population by 2050. Largest free trade zone. $5.2 billion in tech investment in 2021. Africa is the world's next major economic zone. Your reference card, 12 of Africa's major roles in world history. Looking at this table, one thing should strike you immediately: the timeline. Africa's first role, origin of humanity, begins at 300,000 BCE. Africa's most recent role, the economic future, extends to 2100 CE. This is 302,000 years of world historical significance. The colonial period, 1880 to 1960, approximately 80 years, appears in only one row of this 12-row table. Colonialism is not the story of Africa. It is a brutal chapter in a much longer, much richer story. Another thing to notice: the cultural export row. Jazz, blues, rock, hip-hop. These are not minor cultural contributions. These are the most globally consumed music genres in human history. They are all African or African diasporic in origin. And the last row, economic future. This is not speculative. The demographics are fixed. The minerals are in the ground. The free trade area is signed. Africa's future role in world history is going to be very large. And the only question is whether Africa will control the terms of that future, or whether the extraction model will continue. We are in the final section of this video, and I want to use the time to be direct about what Africa's true historical role means for the world today. First, rewrite the historical record. The misrepresentation of Africa's role in world history is not a minor academic dispute. It has political consequences. If you believe that Africa has no significant historical achievements, you are more likely to see African poverty as natural, African governance challenges as cultural, and African demands for fair treatment as unreasonable. The historical lie enables the political injustice. Fixing the historical record is not just about truth. It is about creating the intellectual foundation for just political relationships. Second, the economic repair. CARICOM, the Caribbean community, has formally requested reparations from European governments for the Atlantic slave trade. The argument is legally coherent. The wealth was taken, the harm was documented, the beneficiaries are identifiable, the victims' descendants are identifiable. Justice requires some form of restitution. This is not a radical fringe position. The UN Special Rapporteur on Racism has supported the principle. The conversation is happening. What is needed is political will. Third, partnership, not extraction. The green energy transition is Africa's greatest current opportunity and greatest current threat. The opportunity: Africa has the minerals the world needs. The threat: if those minerals are extracted under the same terms as colonial-era resources, Africa will again contribute its wealth to other people's development. African governments must negotiate processing and value-added industries as conditions of mineral access. No raw cobalt without a battery factory in the DRC. Fourth, African agency. The world's media presents Africa's challenges and waits for international experts to propose solutions. MEPESA, the Green Belt Movement, the TRC, the AFCFTA. Africa is generating solutions. The world needs to listen. 8 takeaways, everyone backed by historical evidence. 1. Africa's role is foundational, not peripheral. 77% of human history is in Africa. The story starts there. 2. African gold financed the world. The Mediterranean, Islamic, and European economies ran on West African gold for 2,000 years. 3. African mathematics and medicine predate Greek equivalents by over 1,000 years. The intellectual chain begins in Africa. 4. African labor built Western capitalism. The Atlantic slave trade and colonialism were the economic engines of the modern Western world. 5. Africa resisted, continuously. Adwa, Nzinga, Mau Mau, Mandela. The resistance is part of the record. 6. Every major global music genre is African. Jazz, blues, rock, hip-hop, reggae. The cultural record is clear. 7. Ubuntu philosophy gave the world one of its most important ethical innovations. The TRC is Africa's gift to international legal theory. 8. Africa's future role is the most important variable in 21st century world history. 2.5 billion people. The world's minerals for the green transition. The world's largest free trade area. Africa will matter enormously. The question is, on whose terms? Africa's role in world history is not a past tense story. It is being written right now. The African Renaissance, the deliberate, organized project of African civilizational renewal. Thabo Mbeki gave it its name and its contemporary intellectual framework in the 1990s. The African Union has institutionalized it in Agenda 2063, a 50-year development vision articulated by Africans, for Africa. The African Renaissance does not ask for external validation. It asserts Africa's right to define its own future. Africa's youth. The median age in Africa is 19 years. The largest generation of young Africans in human history is being educated simultaneously. More young people in university in Africa today than at any previous point in history. These young people are digitally connected, globally aware, and deeply frustrated by governance failures that prevent their countries from reaching their potential. They are starting companies, launching political movements, creating art that is reaching global audiences. They are Africa's most important historical actor. Afrobeats, Burna Boy, Wizkid, Davido, Tyla. These artists are not niche performers in a regional genre. Burna Boy won the Grammy for Best Global Music Album. Tyla won the first ever Grammy for Best African Music Performance. Afrobeats is the fastest growing music genre by global streaming numbers. This is African culture in a position of global leadership, not from the margins, but from the center. The AFCFTA. 54 countries negotiating trade among themselves, reducing dependence on commodity exports to foreign markets. If it works, and there are genuine challenges, it is the most important economic institution Africa has built since independence. The story continues. Africa is writing it. Africa was not peripheral to world history. Africa was world history. The origin of our species, 300,000 years ago. In Africa, the first Homo sapiens took their first breaths, spoke their first words, made their first tools. Every human being alive today is the descendant of those African people, the first civilizations. The Great Pyramid standing 2,000 years before Rome was founded. Timbuktu's universities, educating 25,000 students when London was a market town. The Library of Alexandria, housing the knowledge of the ancient world in Africa. The gold that financed the world. For 2,000 years, African gold backed the Mediterranean, Islamic, and European economies. Without African gold, there is no Venetian trading empire, no Islamic Golden Age, no European Renaissance. The music that became humanity's shared language. Jazz, blues, rock and roll, hip-hop, reggae, Afrobeats. The music the world loves is African music, or music made by the descendants of Africans. The philosophy that taught us dignity. I am because we are. Ubuntu. The concept that human beings exist through their relationships, not in isolation from them. That justice requires healing, not only punishment. Desmond Tutu taught the world this. And the future, 2.5 billion Africans by 2050. The world's youngest, largest workforce. The geological wealth of the green energy transition. The African Continental Free Trade Area. Africa's future role in world history will be enormous. Subscribe to GrioWave Academy. Share this video. Show it to someone who thinks Africa has no history worth learning, and tell them, Africa is not a footnote to world history. Africa is the chapter from which all other chapters begin. Asante. Merci. Thank you. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.